Okay, good. So, hello. Well, from your side, it seems the connection is good. From my side, don't be surprised if I'm disconnected because I'm speaking from Ukraine. We have blackouts, we have electricity like 2 or 3 hours per day, and at the moment we don't have electricity. So I'm at home and we have like a generator and batteries, and that's the only way we can be connected. But I hope it will go smoothly. I'm going to be talking about the myth of 1054. I will give you a historical overview to demonstrate how kind of symbolic is this date. Not really. Its weight nowadays is much stronger than it used to be in the 11th century. Let me begin with a very general statement that the Christian church was always one, but Christians were never completely united. Since the apostolic era, there have been divisions in the global Christian community, which are called schisms, from the Greek word schisma. I think it is incorrect to speak about church divisions because the church is always one and cannot be divided. Therefore, to speak about church divisions, it's like an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense. It is theologically more correct to speak about divisions among Christians. Such divisions have existed since the apostolic era. They've been always perceived as tragedies. The great Syrian theologian Ephraim of Syria, the Syrian, expressed this feeling of tragedies in one of his songs from Carmina Nizibana. I quote him, "And for me in my misery, intercede, O church. I have grieved for thy divisions. May I rejoice in thy union. And with thee and under thy protection may I enter the kingdom." It is easy for Ephraim to provoke, from the Ephraimian perspective, to provoke a division, but very difficult to heal one. Nevertheless, God has the power to bring the church back to unity. And I quote Ephraim, the Syrian, "Lord, for a surgeon it is simple to cut off a limb, but it is not easy for him to fasten it back in its place. But for thee, Lord, both are easy, for thou art God." End of quote. Ephraim was right. It may take months to provoke a schism and centuries to heal one. The longest schism in the Christian history happened in the East in the 5th century. This schism, which I call Great Schism I, had the largest scale the Christian world had ever known. As a result of this schism, 3 Eastern commonwealths emerged: the Byzantine, the Oriental, and the Church of the East. This schism triggered a series of events, eventually leading to the Second Great Schism, the division between the Eastern and Western churches. It is commonly believed that this schism happened in 1054. However, the process of division had begun much earlier, several centuries before that date, and were not completed in the 11th century. Some scholars believe that only the trauma of the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople by the Latins in 1204 made the Easterners mentally break up with the West. This is particularly the point of George Demacopoulos in his studies. One can even suggest that this schism was accomplished as late as the 18th century. In 1729, the congregation Propaganda Fide formally prohibited participation in sacraments over confessional borders. So essentially, they prohibited the Catholics to give communion to the Orthodox. Reciprocally, in 1755, the Ecumenical Patriarchate issued a similar prohibition. So the Ecumenical Patriarchate prohibited its faithful, the Orthodox, to take communion from the Catholics. So that, I think, it could be seen as a formal kind of sacramental finale of this long, centuries-long process of the evolution of the schism, Great Schism II. The earliest cessation of communion between Rome and Constantinople, which lasted several years, happened in the 5th century and has been called the Acacian Schism. It took place from 484 through 519 and was caused by the policies of Emperor Zeno to undermine the Council of Chalcedon. The emperor was supported by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Acacius, who was in office from 472 through 489. However, Pope Felix, who was in office from 483 through 492, considered this move a betrayal of Orthodoxy and excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. The cessation of communion between the churches of Rome and Constantinople that followed can be formally defined as a schism. It became an aftershock of the Great Schism I between the Byzantine and Oriental churches. It also created a dangerous precedent for the events that would happen a few centuries later. Fortunately, the Acacian schism did not mutate into a larger division. It was eventually settled through the intervention of the imperial authority. The same authority, however, created political preconditions for further alienation between the Eastern and Western churches. Excuse me. An apple of discord for the two parts of Christendom became the region sandwiched between Asia Minor and Italy, Eastern Illyria. Actually, it included Croatia as well. After Emperor Theodosius divided the Roman Empire into eastern and western parts, Eastern Illyria became administratively subordinated to Rome. Ecclesially, however, the Church of Constantinople continued claiming its rights over it. The Church of Rome contested these claims. Both the political and ecclesial statuses of this territory were rearranged by later imperial decrees, so that Church of Rome was right to accuse Constantinople of political interventions. When Christianity was adopted by the Bulgars, who had settled in Illyria in the 6th-7th centuries, the churches of Rome and Constantinople contested control over the Bulgarian church. All Christian divisions were caused by the combination of theological, social, and political factors in different proportions. It is difficult to say in what proportions politics and theology contributed to the Great Schism too. The issue of Eastern Illyria was one of the political factors, while the controversy about Filioque was one of the theological factors of the schism. I will not analyze the theological side of Filioque, but will stay on its political side. It had to do with the imperial ideology of the time. Let me make a footnote to say, let me say a few words, or rather sentences, about the political aspect of Filioque. The universal political tenet of the time was that there could be only one empire, and that empire was Roman. The Byzantines believed that their emperor was the true and only Roman emperor, the ruler of the world. The Franks, a new power consolidating Western Europe, initially accepted such a role of the Byzantine Basileus. However, at some moment, they demonstrated an ambition to appropriate the imperial status for themselves. Charlemagne made a decisive step in this direction when he was crowned by Pope Leo III on Christmas 800 as Imperator Romanorum. Coronation by the Pope, however, was only a part of the legitimization of the Frankish ruler as emperor. According to the aforementioned political philosophy of the time, there could be only one Roman emperor in the world. Therefore, to complete his own legitimization as an emperor, Charlemagne had to delegitimize the Byzantine emperors. So this process of emergence of a new emperor had two sides, kind of boosting my own legitimization and delegitimizing my opponent, another contester, another pretender for this position. In other words, to become a legit emperor, Charlemagne had to prove that the emperors of Constantinople had lost their legitimacy. His court ideologists and theologians, who actually were the same people usually, such as Alcuin of York, elaborated arguments to prove Charlemagne's claim. First, they used the situation that the Byzantine throne at the time was held by a woman, Empress Irene, They argued that only a man could be a proper emperor. In addition to this sexist argument, second, they utilized Filioque. Their train of thought was the following. Since at least Theodosius I, the orthodoxy of faith had been one of the main factors of legitimacy for an emperor that distinguished him from the usurpers. If the Frankish theologians could prove that Filioque was the only orthodox interpretation of the Trinity, they would claim that the Easterners, who did not hold it, were apostates and usurpers. Only the Frankish kings who upheld the Orthodox doctrine of Filioque could claim to be true Roman emperors. Under the pressure of this political ideology, Filioque, from an optional theologumenon, so to say, an optional theological idea, turned to a mandatory doctrine with far-reaching political ramifications. In the words of Edward Sichanski, I quote him, "From the obscure theological backwaters that bothered only scholars, the issue of Filioque quickly catapulted to become a casus belli." End of quote. The trophy in this quasi-theological bellum that the Frankish kings had waged was the crown of the Roman Empire. The Easterners picked up the fight. They utilized the issue of Filioque for their own political purposes, just as Charlemagne tried through Filioque to undermine the imperial legitimacy of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine rulers. The latter did the same in the opposite direction. By insisting that Filioque is a heretical doctrine, the Byzantines presented Charlemagne as a typical usurper of the imperial status. These theological underpinnings propelled the Filioque to a prime theological issue that occupied the best Greco-Roman minds. Eventually, Filioque became perceived as a symbol of differences, either imagined or real, between the East and the West. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius, was a protagonist of the Byzantine deconstruction of the Frankish theopolitical constructions based on Filioque. He was both a statesman and a churchman. He clearly saw how politics and theology had been mixed in the Frankish take on Filioque. He also knew how to deconstruct the Franks and turn their arguments against themselves. Although Photius, in the intra-Byzantine policies and quarrels, defended some significant autonomy of the church from the state, when it came to the external threats, like from the Franks, he was an adamant patriot of his state, and he advocated for the interests of the state, not just of the church. Frankish attacks and Byzantine counterattacks led to a schism which was called Photian, very well described, as you know, by Francis Dvornik. It was a cessation in communion between Rome and Constantinople, which had multiple pretexts, including disagreements on ritual practices. The Photian schism was shorter than the preceding Acacian schism. It lasted from 863 through 867, 4 years only. However, during the Photian schism, most arguments were elaborated upon, which later would be utilized for a much longer schism. The Acacian and Photian schisms set unfortunate precedents for the great schism between the East and Western churches that lasts to our days. Before the Photian schism, a rich diversity of beliefs and practices was tolerated in the Eastern and the West. The schisms reduced the space of pluralism and tolerance. Each side now insisted that only its practices and beliefs were right, and the other was wrong, even though they did not bother themselves with such differences earlier. In this polemical spirit, Photius drafted a catalogue of the assumed Western mistakes. He disseminated it among his peers, the patriarchs. In his encyclical letter to the Eastern Patriarchs sent in 866, Photius informed them about the activities of the Western missionaries in Bulgaria. Among the unacceptable Latin practices and beliefs, Photius listed fasting on Saturdays, celibacy of priests, chrismation by bishops, and finally the Filioque. Surprisingly, this list misses an issue that was really divisive. Moreover, it underpinned most other divisive issues between the East and the West. This was the issue of primacy. The Western theologians interpreted the primacy of Roman bishops as a divine institution established by the divine right. They called it ius divinum, the divine right. The East disagreed with such an interpretation. It ascribed such divine right to all patriarchs or none of them. So either all the patriarchs have this right or none of them, no exception to Rome. In the latter case, the case that the patriarchs are perceived as non-having ius divinum, underpinning their authority, the Eastern theologians interpreted primacy as conventional. It stems not from God, but from the consent of other churches and imperial authorities. The East also disagreed with the Western interpretation of primacy as based on the identification of the Roman See with the universal church. The Western discovery of Aristotle and his categories apparently facilitated such an identification. The basic distinction with which the Aristotelian logics enriched Christian theology was the one between commonality and particularity. Medieval Western ecclesiologists effectively identified the Roman See with the common nature of the church, while they regarded other local churches as particularities of this nature. They also adopted the Neoplatonic outlook on the category of commonality as more important than the category of particularities. Such an outlook corroborated the growing Western consensus that the Roman Church was more important than other local churches, including the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Such ideas can be traced in several documents and practices of the time. One of them is Donation of Constantine, a forgery produced in the 8th century. It tells a legend that Pope Sylvester cured Emperor Constantine of leprosy and baptized him. In return, Constantine granted the Pope primacy over the universal church. The idea of the Roman universal jurisdiction was implemented in the Western Church policies during the Fourth Crusade. After the Latins occupied Constantinople, the Pope appointed a new patriarch of the patriarchal city, of the capital city, under his jurisdiction. This move corresponded to the Western perception of the Roman Church as embodying the universal church. After the Byzantines restored their control over Constantinople, the Roman popes continued treating the patriarchs of Constantinople as their own subjects. In medieval Roman ecclesiology, the idea of Rome as the quintessence of the universal church became linked with the idea of particular salvation. I distinguish between the idea of universal salvation given to the entire humankind and particular salvation appropriated by everyone through the synergy with the divine grace, and thus appropriating salvation for him or herself. The papal bull Unam Sanctam, the famous one, which was promulgated in 1302 by Pope Boniface VIII, stated, "We declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff." This bull also implied that to be the true church, any local church has to subject itself to the See of Rome, just as every Christian to be saved has to recognize the authority of the Pope. Both ideas did not make sense to the Easterners. On the one hand, they also believed that particular salvation is possible only in the universal church. On the other hand, since the Church of Rome was for them a particular church, to confine salvation to only one particular church would be dangerous for salvation. Roman claims reduced the availability of salvation. It was if someone would say that one can be saved only in the Church of Alexandria and not in the Church of Antioch, for example. The Easterners thus objected to the Western claims for universal jurisdiction on the soteriological grounds. This framework may help us better understand the story of anathemas in 1054. At the turn of the second Christian millennium, neither the East nor the West could tolerate anymore their growing differences in interpreting primacy and jurisdictions. In 1009, the Patriarch Sergius II of Constantinople and Pope Sergius IV of Rome stopped commemorating each other. This was called the Schism of Two Sergii. It was a prelude to more dramatic events some 50 years later. A chain of events was triggered when Pope Leo IX sent to Constantinople Cardinal Humbert of Silvia Candida with a mission to secure Byzantine help against the Normans ravaging papal dominions in Italy. Although not a remarkable theologian, Humbert was a zealot of the new Roman ecclesiology described earlier. On the margins of the political negotiations at the Byzantine court, the papal legates discussed some theological issues, including the Western practice of using unleavened bread in the Eucharist. At that time, this issue seemed to be the most discussed in the theological exchanges between the East and the West. Such exchanges were routine rituals performed during political missions like this one. Theological discussions did not go well. They were exacerbated by bad personal chemistry between Humbert and Patriarch Michael I Cerularius. The Patriarch demonstratively mistreated the papal delegation. The unnerved cardinal did not grant it to Cerularius. On July 16th, 1054, he rushed to the Cathedral of St. Sophia before the patriarchal liturgy started and placed on the holy table the bull of excommunication of Michael and some other hierarchs close to the Patriarch. After that, the Roman delegation promptly left the city. They were fearing the retaliation, justifiably so. However, Humbert could not anathematize a Patriarch in the Pope's name because Pope Leo IX, who had sent him, was already dead. Humbert acted in a fit of hysterics. He also wanted to demonstrate that he meant it when he insisted on the Roman prerogatives early in the discussions. Now he was applying these prerogatives in practice. The same hysterical was the Constantinopolitan reaction. Patriarch Michael Cerularius, immediately convened an Endymusa Synodos, the so-called ad hoc synod council, which condemned those who had dared to anathematize the Patriarch. The emperor enhanced this decision with an edict. The primate of the Constantinopolitan Church was as politically ambitious as his Western counterparts. He notoriously wore purple shoes, the imperial color. That is why he presented the assault against him as an attack on the imperial authority. He also identified the patriarchal office with the church as such, a common perception even today. In his eyes, as well as in the eyes of later generations, anathema against the Patriarch meant anathema against the church. A minor episode caused by the emotional incontinence of two ambitious hierarchs thus came down to history as a great schism. It was not so much this episode per se as the medieval tendency to equate hierarchy with the church that made the great schism great and possible. Therefore, I believe the ecclesiological underpinnings, the idea that the church is equal to the hierarchy, is the framework that facilitated the schism to happen. And I believe the schism can be undone if we get rid of this medieval identification of the church with the hierarchy of the Patriarch that had caused the schism in the first place. In the meantime, Michael Cerularius informed other Eastern Patriarchs about what happened in the capital. Not all of them shared Michael's uncontrolled anxiety. Patriarch Peter III of Antioch, for example, tried to calm down Michael and reminded him that the Latins are still our brothers, I quote Peter, even if from rusticity or ignorance they attain the same level of accuracy that we ask of our own people. End of quote. Another prominent hierarch of the time, Archbishop Theophylactos of Ohrid, also believed that the difference between the East and the West should not become a reason for breakups. He blamed the Eastern zealots who, I quote him, through unmeasured zeal and lack of humility, were quick to bring all sorts of accusations against the West without thinking through them thoroughly. The anathemas of 1054 passed almost unnoticed by the contemporaries. However, they grew enormous in the perception of future generations. Now we see them as a breaking point in the relations between the East and the West. Because of the tremendous symbolic significance of these anathemas in modern perception, there was an attempt to undo them. In December 1965, soon after the historic meeting of Patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople with Pope Paul VI in Jerusalem in January 1964, the two sees promulgated a joint declaration. It was read synchronically in St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome and the Patriarchal Cathedral of St. George in Istanbul. This declaration was a symbolic gesture. It did not mean to or intend to mean the restoration of communion between the two churches. It acknowledged that what happened in 1054 was a mutual excommunication, not of the churches, but only of some individuals. The lifting of anathemas was appreciated by many in both churches as a token of the restoration of trust between them, not of the relations yet between them, but at least of trust, which is the first step towards the restoration of communion. Some conservatives, however, perceived this event as an act of apostasy. They ascribed to it more significance than what was intended with this act. Actually, both sides acted as if the anathemas of 1054 were a sort of myth. So the kind of radical anti-ecumenical reaction to the lifting of anathema among the conservatives is a consequence of this mythologization of the year 1054. Therefore, my kind of last conclusion, by demythologization of 1054, we can facilitate the reception of the lifting of anathemas among those who object this lifting. So it's important to, I believe, to strip this date of unnecessary significance and mythology. Thank you for your attention.